Good evening, everybody. Apologies for my voice. I'm recovering from laryngitis, but I hope that you'll be able to hear. Please, if you don't and you want me to repeat anything at the end, just ask and I will do so. Now, welcome to our final installment of our Beyond the Label series. And I'm very privileged to look at logical thinking this evening, which is going beyond the basics. And the last few weeks we've been spending on the basics, and just remind ourselves what we've said. So first of all, we said that the whole issue of dyslexia has been disputed all over the years. There's never been one single definition of dyslexia that specialists agree with. Just the extent that the DSM-5, which is our international authority on all mental disorders, including learning difficulties, have actually removed dyslexia from the manual. And what it does, it has replaced it with a general condition called specific learning disorder. And specific learning disorder could include reading and comprehension difficulties, or spelling and written expression difficulties, or number concepts or mathematical reasoning difficulties. So you can see it's kind of our old captions of dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, but it's been removed from the manual in terms of the names. It's just the descriptions that remain. It's important, according to the manual, that these difficulties must have been observed for 6 months despite receiving targeted help. That the children's academic skills should also be below expectation, that these difficulties should have started during school age. So even if you're diagnosed as an adult, your difficulties should have started in school age. Then it's important that these difficulties are not the result of an intellectual disability, neurological conditions, vision or hearing, or any economic or instructional disadvantages that there might have been. So if you've had a long period of illness and you've missed a lot of education, then that would not constitute a specific learning disorder. What's also important is that a diagnosis is no longer made just with an intellectual test, an IQ test like in the past, but now it's through a more holistic approach of interviews, family history, school reports, etc. So kind of getting a wider impression of how the child is doing before a diagnosis is made. It's also important that it takes a real shift away from in the past, where a dyslexia diagnosis meant an acceptance that a child would never be able to progress. And it totally turns it on its head, where instead a child is just diagnosed when they have reading difficulties. In other words, if they don't have those reading difficulties or those math difficulties or those written expression difficulties, they would no longer require a diagnosis. And that leads us to really changing our perception of dyslexia. And the first way we're going to change it is by not perceiving it as a disability anymore, but rather as an inability. So rather than compensating and just saying, well, we just need to chunk, we just need to give concessions, we just need to do less with the child and reduce our expectations of the child. We're actually going to have a development focus. Well, because if we can develop those skills, then the child would no longer require that diagnosis. And we're going to think wider than just the more traditional interventions of phonics and sight words, which most institutions would go to when you work with children with dyslexia. And instead, we're going to look at all the skills that underlie learning, because there must be a reason why the child has struggled to learn to read. And often we find that in those skills that underlie learning and reading. And those are the language base, which we've said in the past, that kind of develops before school age, where a child develops their ability to express themselves, to have receptive language, and to be able to communicate and have a vocabulary knowledge. So we're kind of assuming that basis at EduBlocks. And then we really focus on those skills that build onto that language base of concentration, processing, memory, logical reasoning, which we're looking at tonight, and then ultimately ending up at reading. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been looking at these skills, mostly within the structure of a memory or memory system, because our memory system as a whole constitutes our information processing system. You'll see in this diagram that, yes, you've got your sensory memory, which is your first memory, and please go back to our previous ones to learn more about it. But attention comes in really early, that if you can't concentrate and give attention to the stimuli that's coming in, you're not going to be able to comprehend, you're not going to be able to remember. So attention cannot be separated from memory. And so perception, which we talked about last week, which is your ability to recognize what you see and recognize what you hear, can also not be loosened and separated from memory. Because if you make faulty recognitions, you're going to have a faulty memory. Then we've talked as well about the wider processing of the working memory. The working memory is the place where we really make sense of what's in our short-term memory, where we link that to information that's in our long-term memory, where we draw connections, where we give meaning to what we've seen and what we've heard. Now, the working memory, as you'll remember, has lots of elements to it, but part of those elements are your long-term memory, your short-term memory. So if your memory is poor, you're going to struggle with working memory. And the pinnacle of the working memory is that it enables us to do higher cognitive functions, like decision-making, like judgments, like logical thinking. And that's why logical thinking is our end webinar, because logical thinking really moves beyond the basic structure to move into our higher cognitive functions. So what is logical thinking? Logical thinking is the act of analyzing a situation or a problem using reasoning and then coming up with potential solutions. Okay, sounds complicated, doesn't it? But basically it entails that we perceive a problem, we gather relevant information about the problem, we assess those facts, and then we methodically decide on a good way to move forward. And what's important, and you can hear from that, because first we gather, then we assess, then we methodically, which also means systematically, decide on the best way to move forward. So at the basis, at the heart of logical thinking is the ability to sequence or our sequential thoughts. And if you remember back to one of our previous ones, we actually looked at the importance of sequential memory for reading and spelling. So it's also very important, therefore, for our higher cognitive functions that we are able to sequence and remember sequences. Okay, so we've got a poll, and Valerie will run the poll for us, where I want you to look at these three different examples. This is logical sequences, a type of exercises that we would do at EduBlocks with children that struggle with logical thinking skills. And in each case, there's a rule that tells us how the blocks will follow on each other. And in each case, a few blocks have been left out. So I would like you to establish the rule and then tell me what the next few blocks will be. Okay, so we've got three different examples. Valerie, are you ready to run the poll? Valerie, can you end the poll for me, please? I'm really sorry, guys, but actually we've given you the answers in the poll. So instead of doing a poll, I'm going to just reason through with you with each example. Okay. So let's just move ahead. Okay, there we go. We get to the answers. So if we look at the first sequence, I want you to, in your head, see if you can get the right answers. So please think about it for a second. And then we're going to look at why it's those answers. So first, you'll see that it's a sequence that repeats. So we have the black, the yellow, the blue, the white, the red, and then the colors repeat: the black, the yellow, the blue, the green. So what should still repeat is the white and the red. But instead of just repeating it one by one block, each block becomes two. So we can see that it's a repeating sequence where each block repeats as two blocks, leaving us with the two whites and the two reds. So that's a quite simple one that we would do at the lower level of cognitive, of logical thinking development with learners. There's a single rule. Then we move on to a more complex one, which is actually a reversing pattern, or reversing sequence. And what's interesting is that it just doesn't just reverse in terms of black, black, yellow, yellow, red, red, white, white, but it reverts into pairs. So the yellow and the black that's in the middle repeats yellow, black. Then the white, blue, and the white, blue. So we would therefore assume that it would be the same in the next case, that the blue and the green would repeat next. And therefore, the missing blocks should be the final pair, which is red and white. So this one has two rules embedded. It reverses, and then it also reverses in pairs, so not just a simple reverse. Okay. Then we look at a more complex one. Okay, so this one, if you look at it, this gets a little bit scary to look at, but actually it's a repeating pattern as well. So it repeats, but if you look at it, it doesn't repeat as it is. It also doesn't repeat in a very simple manner that we can just easily see. So here we are going to have to use a little bit more logical thinking skills to come up with a solution. And if you think, look at the first two examples, the green and the red and the green are the blocks that aren't repeating as they should. So we're going to make a hypothesis. My first hypothesis is going to be that maybe the second and the third blocks swap over on every repeat, because that makes sense. In the first one, it was green, red, and now it's red, green. So to test that hypothesis, we're going to go to the next second and third blocks and see if it swapped again. But then we see, no, it didn't, because this time it's red and yellow. That doesn't make sense. So I have to go back to the drawing board and make a second hypothesis. So if I look at my green and my red again, okay, and my red and my green, I can see that my second green block has actually moved up a place. It's jumped to the red and gone and stood behind the red. So if we kind of use that hypothesis that it kind of moves up a place each time it repeats, we would therefore expect that on the next repeat, the green should be after the yellow. And indeed it is. Okay, so that gives us enough confidence then to say that maybe then the last one will also follow that. So therefore the green should now be behind the blue, and the rest of the sequence should repeat as it is. And that gives us our solution. So you can see a little bit of logical thinking in action, how we really think in steps, how we really have to understand first what we're given before we can decide how we're going to get to a solution. So we had to establish that we have a repeating pattern. And then we had to go and look and apply different reasoning techniques to discover the answer. So let's look at some of those skills that underlie logical thinking. Now, at heart, logical thinking is problem solving. You identify why the problem is happening, you brainstorm solutions, and then you decide which solution you're going to move for. So you can see what we've done. We've had two hypotheses on the last one. We had to therefore test those and decide which one we're going to go with. And to do that, you require critical thinking skills. You cannot understand facts and questions properly if you cannot think critically, because often it's not just easy to see. You have to really dig in to see what the problem is actually asking you, particularly on our final example. If you couldn't think critically, you wouldn't have been able to suss that actually it's a block that moves up. And you have to be accurate. Now, a lot of children that struggle with critical thinking would struggle with just understanding the basic question. So they will sit there, look at the question, read the question over and over, look at the facts, and just not be able to make sense of what they're reading and what they're seeing. Then it's the next step. You need to be able to think creatively. Now, logical thinking, you often think as mathematical, so therefore it is just logic. It's the opposite of creativity. So you would have a creative person that's arty, and then you would have a person that's logical. They just think in numbers. But actually, creativity is important in logical thinking because you need to have the ability to think outside the box sometimes. Like we looked at that last final example, it wasn't an example that just jumped out at you. It wouldn't have made sense. You would have looked at that one and just thought, it just doesn't follow any rule that I can think of. So you have to think of new ways to connect facts. So creative thinkers are people that can really think outside of the box and make connections where other people might not be able to see them. And then you need to be able to reason. So again, when we were looking at particularly at the final example, we had to go and say, okay, so we have our hypothesis. We thought creatively. We thought, okay, maybe it's a swap. We had to go and test that hypothesis by applying it to the next example and seeing if it came back true. So we had to reason through it to be able to come to our final solution. Now, we need to stand still a little bit on reasoning skills, because reasoning skills really is a very important underlying skill of logical thinking. If you struggle with reasoning, you're going to struggle with logical thinking. Now, one of the first types of reasoning skills, which we use so often, particularly in not just mathematics, but in reading and in reading comprehension, is the ability to make inferences. So we would take facts and then we would assume and make assumptions based on the facts. So let's just look at an example to make it practical. We have this boss coming to his employee, you can read there, and he said that someone sends him these anonymous emails about being a bad boss, and he has discovered that this happens every time that he leaves that person's office. So his assumption based on the known facts is, I get these emails, I get them every time I leave your office, so therefore you must have sent them. So he makes an assumption, he makes an inference based on the facts. Now, in this case, as you can see in the last bit, it's a false inference. It was actually the guy there in the background that sent the emails. But which points out that also any inferences we make need to be based on evidence. And children that struggle with inferences will first of all struggle to make assumptions based on facts, but they will also struggle then to evidence their assumptions. And if you're looking for, particularly in essays that are argumentative, you will find that the children will need to make a point in their writing, and then they're going to have to explain the point they've made. But children that struggle with making inferences will struggle to understand how they can evidence what they have seen or what they want to say. So it's based on reading comprehension as well as writing. Now, our next point of reasoning is inductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning means that you go from the specific to the general. So you have a specific observation that you make, and then based on that specific observation, you make general statements or general assumptions. You can look at this very silly example of a penguin that says penguins are black and white, and some old TVs are black and white. So therefore, I would assume that some penguins are actually all TV shows, which is very relevant based on the facts. But it doesn't make sense in reality, does it? Now, where do we use inductive reasoning? Mathematics is a very good example, where we might have a situation where 1 is odd and 3 is odd, and the sum of 1 and 3 is 4, which is an even number. So in other words, if I take this one odd and I take the other odd, I get an even number. And from that, you could get a general statement. For example, that any odd number plus 1 would be an even number. You could also make a more broader statement of saying that if I add any 2 odd numbers together, I'm going to get an even number. So you use your specific to come to a general conclusion. Now, the opposite of inductive is deductive. So where inductive goes from specific to general, deductive goes to general, from general to specific. So we might know something generally to be true, and therefore we then apply it to a specific context. Now, very simple examples in mathematics, you'll have if A is B and B is C, then it must follow that A is also C. Okay, very simple example of deductive reasoning. In terms of more general statements, you could say that if it's that I know it to be dangerous to drive on icy streets, is very commonly accepted. So therefore, if the streets are icy now, in this specific context, it would be dangerous to drive on the streets. So I should refrain. Okay, and then again in mathematics, just looking at some rules, if all numbers ending on 0 or 5 are divisible by 5, that's a rule that is known, I know it. Then if a number 35 that ends up with a 5 will therefore be divisible by 5. So we can make that assumption based on the knowledge that we have in the general. Okay. Now, it's very commonly accepted that logical thinking skills are the form, a basis of mathematics and of mathematical problem solving and word problems. But we don't always accept so easily that it's just as equally important for reading and writing. So let's just have a look at reading. Now, in terms of reading, it's mostly extremely important for reading comprehension. Because when you read, you're not only focused on the word that you're reading, but you're also focusing on the words that came before. You're also focusing on the word that came after. You have to make sense of what you read, and then you also have to make connections. So to read with understanding is very much led by logical thinking. When we do comprehensions or answer questions about text, for example, we need to draw conclusions based on the available information. So we have to make inferences. Inferences are very, very important in reading comprehension. We need to make associations, and we need to notice relationship between the facts that we are reading, which means we use deductive and inductive reasoning. Very important in reading comprehension. Spelling rules. Spelling rules are all based on logic. I know there's a lot of exceptions which aren't necessarily logical, but you need to have a rule before you can have exceptions. So spelling is full of rules. And children need to learn a rule, and then they have to encounter it in a new situation and therefore apply that rule. So we go from the general to the specific. Okay, so we have which kind of reasoning? We have inductive reasoning. Okay, so silent E is one of the examples where we learn that if I add a silent E to the end, it changes the short sound to the name of the sound. So the E to the E or the A to the A. The doubling the consonant rule, short vowel, double, long vowel, single. And then we have to apply it. Now, writing again, I mean, we don't commonly think about logical thinking in writing, but it's important in a very basic level for sentence structure and punctuation. Because again, a sentence structure normally follows rules. We have a subject and object. We have the noun, we have the verb, and then we have the adverbs, the adjectives that describe it. All of that needs to be understood. You've got your past tense, your present tense, your future tense, each one that has rules related to it. Your punctuation rules, you need to understand, is it logical for me to have a capital letter here, or is it not logical for me to have a capital letter here? You need to use that knowledge to make those decisions. We talked about word groups of nouns, pronouns, etc. that all have rules that apply and logic that you need to apply to be able to answer the questions about it. Linguistic devices like alliteration, like onomatopoeia. For all of those, you need to be able to use logic. When you get a poem, you need to break that poem down into the basics, and you need to be able to understand how everything works together and how it makes meaning. All logical thinking. And then in terms of getting your thoughts onto paper, okay, a lot of children that struggle with logical thinking skills, and particularly also with sequencing, which forms the basis of logical thinking, would struggle to get their words out on paper. They might be able to do an oral perfectly. And then you ask them, go and write that oral down into an essay. And suddenly it's just impossible. And that's often because they struggle with sequencing their thoughts onto paper. And the one thing that is an element of that is sense. They'll often find that they kind of lose that, goes off on a tangent and totally lose the sense of what they're doing. Or really, when you read it, it's just garbled and it's impossible to really understand what the learner is putting down. Then the sequencing of their thoughts. Sometimes they got really good thoughts, but it's just in a haphazard manner. It just, one thought here, one thought over there, and it just doesn't make a structured unit. So sequencing is a very important skill in writing, and that is also logical, because you need to think about how you're going to structure your thoughts so that you build that unit. And then you need to organize your paragraphs, organize your story in terms of knowing that, okay, I've sequenced my fact, but which of those belong together? Which will I put in the first paragraph? How will I make it my second paragraph? So the organization of your thoughts and how you have sequenced is equally important, and lots of children struggle with that. So how do we develop our logical thinking skills in children? I think we can all agree that it's extremely important, not just for the mathematics, but for all curriculum subjects. So we have to develop it from a very young age. Now, at home, these are the things that you can do. Creative hobbies like drawing, dancing, music are really good to teach children sequencing and to teach them how to put things together into a unit. And they can apply that in their other skills as well. Now, strategy games, like I'm not a computer whiz at all, but Minecraft is a brilliant game to teach children logical thinking. I mean, all these different games where they need to create things, and to be able to create them, they need to have certain things in place. They need to decide where they're going to spend their attention and where they're going to get the maximum yield. All those kind of strategy games, even silly things, simple games like Sudoku, even building puzzles. I mean, just building a puzzle. Where am I going to start? Am I going to do the edges first? Am I going to do the colors and organize all the different colors together? Or am I going to go buy a picture and see if I can get everything that belongs to that part of the picture together? So strategy is extremely important, and that can be developed in so many different games, so many apps as well that have strategy games. Then in your discussions with your child, always make sure that you question them and that you encourage them to ask meaningful questions. So try not to just tell your child, but to have discussions with them so that they also understand your reasoning. So if you say to them, unfortunately, you can't do this, don't just say, because I said no, and that's my no, and therefore you just have to accept it. Explain to them how your thinking led to the fact that you said no. Get them to maybe then ask questions about your reasoning. If they don't agree with your reasoning, let them prove to you that you are wrong and that you should change your mind. Now, you can't do that always, but when there's opportunities, try to do engage with your children in that conversations, because that teaches them to think through things, to think of consequences, to make good choices. Okay. And the same when your child is doing homework and struggling, don't just give them the answer. Try and use questioning to lead them to discover the answers themselves. Even their mistakes, they can discover themselves if you just point them in the direction of the mistake and say, can you see you've made a mistake here? Can you tell me what that mistake is? The more they can think for themselves, the more they can think logically. Then we really underestimate the power of socialization with peers. Group play, understanding the rules of play, understanding turn taking, understanding other children's perspectives and perceptions and how it might differ from their own, understanding how other people think and reason is extremely important in your child developing their own thinking skills and their own reasoning and their own perceptions. Then we talked about discuss choices and consequences. When your child wants to act in a certain way, encourage them to think about the consequences before they make their choices, and try and give them choices. So don't just say, we're going, you can choose one gift. or one little present for one little game from the shop, say to them, well, let's think about the options. What type of things might we want, and why might we want those different things? So my little 8-year-old would say, I want a gun. I say, okay, one of these play guns. How many guns have you already got? Do you think it makes sense to get another one? Will you ever play with it? How does it compare with the ones that you've already got? Do you think it's going to be as good as some of them, or are you going to just discard it and you just like it in the shop? What might we look at maybe getting that you will really play with, and that will make a difference to your toys, and actually add value to your toys? So, something really, really silly like that could get your child thinking logically. Okay. Now, if your child struggles, and if particularly, I mean, as we've talked through this, I think you've also seen the logic of how EduBlocks functions, that we look at reading difficulties as a symptom rather than a problem. And we go and find the reasons for that in the skills that underlie learning. So it's skills that already exist, and it just makes sense. So it is just logical that a child that struggles with reading would struggle with some of those skills. We've talked about sequence, how all the skills build on each other, how you cannot remember if you cannot pay attention, how you cannot pay attention if you don't know what you should pay attention to. So if you think about your working memory, that tells you what is important and what you should pay your attention to. You can't just indiscriminately pay attention to absolutely everything. There needs to be a logic to how you divide your attention or where you focus your attention. We talked about perception, how perception is so linked to memory. If you can't remember things that happened in the past and remember experiences and remember words, you cannot link new facts to it. So again, memory is so interlinked with perception, and everything works together and builds on each other. So there's a logic to how you develop these skills. You can't expect that your child is going to start developing their reading from the word go before you've actually addressed some of those other skills. So again, there's a sequence to it. Work on your memory, work on your perception, and therefore your reading will improve over time as a sequence. So EduBlocks really thinks about how things work together and how it builds on each other. And all our activities are created to build those skills systematically and to the best effect. So if your child is struggling with memory, perception, processing, with attention, with logical thinking, please come to EduBlocks. We've developed our program scientifically over more than 35 years, and we've got about 40 plus franchises all through the country. We've helped thousands of children, not only in South Africa, but also in other countries. But we're really growing in America, for example, where children are not getting the right support through their schools. But remember that we're not only there for children that struggle, we also work with children that just want to hone their skills and just want to even get better at what they're already good at and improve their grades. So our program makes smart learners smarter by developing and strengthening skills. Okay. Now, if you're more curious about what we do and how we can help your child, please go to edublocks.co.za, and you can go and read some of the stories of the parents that have been at EduBlocks and that have found the help that they require for their child, often after such a long journey of struggling and trying different things and not getting the results that they need. And the secret really is just go back to the basics and build it up sequentially. Simple, yet effective. So if you have any questions, please ask. And thank you very much for listening. And please do go back to some of our other webinars if you've missed it, because they do build on each other as well to form a unit.